If you're not warming up before training or intense activity, then you're playing with fire. I get it. You're busy, you don't have time to warm up, but if you don't pay the small time fee now, you'll be paying much more in interest down the line when you're no longer able to play your sport, or worse, not able to move properly due to chronic injury. Welcome back, I'm Ferro, and in this video, we're gonna go over the warm-up in its entirety, all three aspects of it. First, the physiological response that occurs when we warm up, its ability to prevent or not prevent injury in sports, and the best methods to achieve a proper warm-up. By the end of this video, you'll know what it takes to warm up and can decide for yourself whether or not it's worth it. So first, we'll take a look at the physiological response that occurs within the body when we warm up. I'll try to stay away from complicated terms and jargon as much as possible, but I'm sure some will sneak in. So the main purpose of warming up is to increase our internal body temperature, but not just our general body temperature, but specifically the temperature of our tissues, of our muscle. The temperature increases in three different ways, the first being friction from muscle contractions, the second being the ignition of our metabolism, and the third being blood vessel dilation. These three things all lead to an increase in tissue temperature, which in turn lead to many other physiological changes. One of those being that as the temperature increases, our metabolism is given the opportunity to slowly adapt to the change over time, instead of having to quickly turn on the boosters to catch up with the intense activity that we're now doing if we skip the warm-up. The next physiological response is increased circulation of blood through the muscles, which enhances the oxygen supply. And the reason this matters is because our muscles run off of two main fuel sources, oxygen and glucose. So in this case, getting as much oxygen as possible is really important. And on top of increased oxygen supply, the working muscles are actually able to more efficiently extract the delivered oxygen from the blood. And then finally, we have a sped up nerve response as a result of warming up, so our muscles are able to contract more quickly as our nerves are firing more quickly. Okay, so that's what the body's actually doing when we warm up, but do any of these things really matter in sport as far as preventing injury? It seems obvious that these things would improve performance, but that's not what we're looking at here. The question is, does warming up before intense activity decrease the risk of injury? And if so, how? Well, let's take a look. So due to the physiological adaptations that we just looked at, one of the byproducts is reduced muscle and joint stiffness. Now that obviously sounds like it matters, and that's because it does. The less stiffness there is in our muscles, and especially in our joints, the more range of motion we'll have. And if you've watched any of my past videos, or you know what we're all about here on the channel, you know that increased range of motion, as long as there's efficiency in those ranges, means that we're more resilient to unexpected or awkward positions that we might accidentally get into during sport or even just moving around in our lives. Walking down the stairs, you could trip. Walking through mud, you could slip, and any of these could result in an awkward position. The greater efficient range of motion that you have, the more safely you'll be able to get in and out of those positions. So reduced muscle and joint stiffness that leads to increased range of motion seems to naturally be a good thing for injury prevention. An experiment was actually done on bunnies, which I'm not saying I condone this in any way, but the experiment was done nonetheless, so might as well learn from it. And it showed that when heat had been applied to a bunny's tibialis anterior muscle, it loosened it in such a way that the amount of force that was required to actually tear that muscle was significantly more than if that heat, which symbolized the warm-up, had not been applied. So don't call PETA on me. I didn't conduct this experiment, but an observation we can pull from there is that warming up or increasing the tissue's temperature before performing high intensity movement, and remember, high intensity movement could be a result of engaging in sport, or like our ancestors, it could be running away from a bear when your life is in danger. So we clearly saw in this experiment that a proper warm-up would mean that your body is able to tolerate more force before injury. Again, seems like a good thing for injury prevention. Statistics show that the majority of muscular and tendon injuries that occur are in the antagonist muscle. So in the muscular system, we have two types of muscles that are working at the same time. We have agonist and antagonist muscle. The agonist is the muscle that is actively contracting, and the antagonist is the opposite one. is the one on the opposite side that is relaxing and lengthening when the agonist is contracting and tightening. So for example, in the arm, if the bicep is the agonist and is contracting, then the tricep is the antagonist and is relaxing and lengthening. In the leg, if the hamstring is the agonist and is contracting and tightening, then the quadricep is one of the antagonists that is relaxing and lengthening. So the research has been showing that the muscle that is attempting to quickly relax and lengthen as a response to the quick contractile force of the agonist is the one that tears because it has too much stiffness and is not able to lengthen quickly enough. So if we combine that understanding with knowing that warming up increases the tissue's ability to lengthen quickly in response to high force, then it would make sense that warming up would decrease muscular injury, at least in the antagonist muscles that have been tearing in response to the contractile force being acted on them due to the agonist. Now, I've actually experienced this before, but not in the acute sense where the muscle would tear immediately like it would if you saw a sprinter sprinting down the track and then suddenly they grab their hamstring and collapse or slowly decrease speed into a limp. But instead in the chronic sense, where over time, when there's just constant tightness and strain and tugging on the tendons and the muscles and the joints, that leads to an imbalance in the musculature that causes weakness, instability, and obviously pain. So not all chronic injuries are a result of a poor warm-up, but they can certainly inflame the issue. And if you were already on your way to injury, then a lack of warm-up is just going to expedite the process. So I remember for me personally, when I was doing my track workouts in college, after an improper warm-up, or I would go play volleyball or some other sport with my friends and I would entirely skip the warm-up, I would feel very quickly that a certain part of my hip and my lower back would tighten up. And this wasn't an acute injury, but this was chronic tightness and pulling that resulted from not warming up in the past and led to an imbalance. Now, this is certainly not to say that warming up is going to fix all of your problems, but if it has even a 2% effect on whether or not you get injured, it's worth the few minutes that it'll take to do the warm-up. And it'll make the workout and training session more efficient, and your body will have a better adaptive response to your workout. So you may be wondering, well, you just mentioned that our ancestors would run away from bears and other large animals. They certainly didn't need to warm up, and that's true. They most likely didn't have to warm up to prevent injury. And the reason for that is most likely because they lived active lifestyles. It was more uncommon for them to be sedentary and sitting for a long time than it was for them to be active and moving around. So their body and their tissues were able to quickly adapt to increasing body temperature quickly, sparking the metabolism to go at the drop of a hat whenever it was needed, because their bodies and joints were lubricated and ready to move whenever necessary. Whereas we, over the generations, have engineered exercise and movement out of our lives, and so our bodies have physiologically adapted, because our bodies will always adapt in the opposite direction. So we're more efficient at being sedentary than moving. So our tissues will take time to increase temperature and experience those physiological changes necessary for sports performance and injury prevention. So guys, if you're liking this video, go ahead and obliterate the like button for the algorithm to get this pushed out to as many people as possible so we can help them unlock their athletic potential and live pain-free lives. Thanks for doing that, and now let's take a look at what methods we can use to warm up properly before engaging in high-intensity movement. So the first method is known as passive warm-up. We know that the majority of the warm-up's physiological responses are a result of an increase in tissue temperature. So a passive warm-up is just increasing our body temperature with a hot shower, a sauna, heating pads, or even just standing out on a hot day for long enough. Now, this method works to some degree. It's better than nothing, but the issue here is that studies are actually showing that this passive kind of warm-up actually just increases our general body temperature and will increase the temperature and blood flow primarily to our skin instead of the muscles and tissues that we need it in for performance. So what should we do instead? Well, we have two options, and there's certain cases where one makes more sense than the other. So we have the passive warm-up that we talked about, and then we have the active warm-up. And within the active warm-up, there's two categories as well. We have the general active, and the specific active. So the general is just using all the muscles, going for a quick run, hopping on a bike, and just getting the blood pumping through all the muscles and the whole body. Typically, this type of warm-up is perfectly sufficient for any kind of low intensity training or non-complex sport and movement. However, the other type, specific active warm-up, is going to be using specifically the muscles, tendons, joints, connective tissue, everything that is required for the specific activity that we're going to be engaging in. For example, a tennis player that is going to be serving overhand, whacking the ball with the racket is going to want to warm up their shoulder joint with gradually increasing from moderate to high intensity serving. Now that doesn't mean that if you're going to perform a high intensity or high complexity activity to just jump into doing that movement right away. Instead, it's important to always start with a general active warm-up to get all of the muscles to increase in temperature and get the blood flowing well throughout the entire body before moving on to the more specific exercises that will increase the neurological connection as well as prepare the body to perform those actions well. These kind of specific movements within the warm-up actually increase our neurological connection to those movements. If you've ever heard of a term called muscle memory, that's what this is. It's actually the nerve endings that connect to the brain and the muscle, building a pathway to fire in a specific way. The muscle doesn't remember anything. It's the nerves that are connected to the brain. So it's really the brain that remembers everything by establishing these neural connections. If we do this specific active warm-up, then we're not only preparing our body to perform it in the near future, but we're also getting more reps in to increase that pathway for long-term success. Now, how long should we be warming up for? Well, the general consensus says it should be anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be doing high intensity, more complex exercise, then you want to start off really easy and general like we mentioned, and then nearing the 10 to 15 minute mark, get more intense and more specific in your movements to prepare for what you're going to be doing. After the 5 to 15 minute warm-up, you want a 5 to 10 minute recovery from the warm-up. You will have used up a good amount of oxygen and maybe even some of your glycogen stored depending on how intense your warm-up was. We want to reduce how much of our glucose that we're using in the warm-up. That's why it's great to do a general low intensity warm-up and slowly build in to more intense so that the intense part is only a very small period of time so that we're still prepared to perform well. So after you've completed your warm-up, you want to make sure that you maintain a high tissue temperature up until you're actually ready to perform your activity. So to do this, you can just throw on some warm clothes or stay out in the sun or stay moving very lightly, sticking to general things, nothing too intense or complex. You're not tiring yourself out. The heat is able to remain in our muscles for around 45 minutes. So as long as we're not going past that, you shouldn't have to do anything more dynamic or intense in the waiting time between your warm-up and your actual activity. So this kind of warming up is not easy to do all the time, but try to implement this next time you go for your training session, and you'll likely notice improved performance in your training. One of the most important things that we can do for our functional health is to not get hurt. So make a habit of warming up and you'll spare your future self from having to deal with a whole plethora of issues. So now that you're warm, check out this video next to begin training your warm muscles and bulletproofing your knees. I'll see you over there. Go be human.